social science research, and this may seem like a catch question, and you know I don't indulge in catch questions, but from what you know of the way we behave, what goes on under the surface as a people, do you think there is much chance that we'll likely be that analytic at the level where it counts in this political process and overcome the nativism, which I think I share in part? I wouldn't just condemn the Pat Buchanans and the others and say, oh, they're there and I'm here. I think we're talking about the feelings, otherwise there'd be a different political result of the efforts made. What do you think? Do you think we're going to make that jump so that we adapt on the political level what you have learned as a social scientist?
Let me veer off and then sort of come back to that.
Well, you're going to do it anyway. So.
Right, okay. Well, first, as far as the sort of cultural conservatism that you just confessed to, I would say don't worry so much. All the work that we've done, and these are other studies now, looking at the children, the offspring of immigrants, of this wave of immigrants, suggests that far from a cultural invasion, it's really a cultural assimilation. That is, if you look at, say, language use, which is something that's relatively easy to measure, what you find is that in most of these groups, by the second generation, the native language has almost disappeared, and that 98% of them are fluent in English.
So the old patterns remain?
The old patterns may remain in the first generation, and then there's a kind of a hybrid pattern in the second generation.
No. I meant the old patterns of the immigration when my grandparents came here.
Yes. I mean, we were very concerned way back when we started work on immigration in the early 90s that the old patterns wouldn't hold, and that this group of immigrants, being largely non-European immigrants, would be different. And we worried they'd be different because they would suffer more racial discrimination, because the economy had changed. There weren't good industrial jobs, industrial sector jobs, manufacturing jobs, and because they were coming into the big immigrant receiving cities where the schools had somewhat deteriorated since the 100 years ago when the last big immigrant wave came. And we found that, yes, these schools aren't so good. Yes, there's some discrimination. Yes, there aren't jobs in the manufacturing sector, but there are service sector jobs. Overall, what we find is these kids, this is a big study in New York, these kids are moving through U.S. schools, New York schools. Some of the groups are getting wonderful education, actually, in New York schools by using the competitive high schools and so forth. They're then moving into the service sector, working class. And by and large, when you compare them to their demographic native-born peers, they're doing as well or better, both in education, in income, and employment. And as far as culturally, they're creating wonderfully in New York their own hybrid culture, which is enriching the city, and which is certainly not a cultural invasion.
Why don't we know that as a people? You know it.
We know it because we've looked hard, and because we're sort of getting the early signal, and we know what everybody will know in another 10 years, it seems to me.
Yes, another 10 years of political divisiveness.
Well, that's true. That's true. And really, politics is very much driven by nostalgia of the way things were. And I look at cultural conservatives like Pat Buchanan, and I think, he wants to return to the way things were 50 years ago. And he regrets that immigration is somehow part of a process of change, which he regrets. We can never go back, obviously. But that doesn't mean that we're losing the essence of the American system, which these families were very upwardly mobile, very highly motivated. I mean, if you emigrate here, that in itself is a very difficult thing to do. And these tend to be pretty successful, tight families, which are able to instill in their children a real discipline to succeed.
One word we haven't used: globalization. How does it impact upon the question of immigration?
That's a good question and nicely timed, because When I talk about nostalgia, I think what we're being nostalgic for is the pre-globalized world, when nation states were nation states and where they didn't really defend their borders all that much, but they didn't have to defend their borders because nobody was rich enough to move across those borders. Now, with the decline in the price of travel, with the general increase in wealth in the developing countries, now it becomes quite possible for workers in third world countries to think of coming here, and they can, and they do. Furthermore, they've become detached from their own, in their own countries, they've become detached from the land in ways that they weren't 50 years ago. So within their own countries, they've become more mobile as they've been, say, attracted to cities because of industrialization in cities in developing countries and so forth. Once they move off their own farms, they then become more mobile, and the possibility of moving here becomes more realistic. Let's not get carried away, though. Globalization, as far as the movement of people, is sort of much less in percentage terms than in terms of the movement of capital, the movement of production, the movement of ideas. Certainly, that has been a much more pervasive move. Just to put some numbers on it, the entire world population of migrants is about 200 million out of a world population of 6 billion. So we're talking about well less than something like 3% live in countries where they weren't born. The U.S. now leads the pack. We have 40 million foreign-born in the U.S.
As much as I am concerned as you are about what is happening in the political scene and the social scene, the anger that has been generated by the question of immigration, when I do think back, whatever the statistics were at that time, I do know there was the nativism of the period when my grandparents came here, the nativism of the beginnings of the last century were extreme. There really isn't that much difference, isn't it? We're here, and it's sort of the reverse of not in my backyard. Don't come into my backyard, even no matter how recently I've come here. I'm now a native.
Right.
No one else.
Right. Pull up the gangplank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, what kind of comment is it? Maybe not such a bad comment because we've all gone through it.
Yeah. Well, I think the country went through a period in the middle of the 20th century of very low immigration from 1924 to 1965. They sort of cut off the immigration flow. And in 1965, during the civil rights period, it was revived. And I think we've, as a nation, taken a while to sort of get used to what was going on. It's interesting, the big immigrant receiving cities, the top 6 or 8, are pretty used to this. We're talking about New York, Los Angeles are the 2 main ones, but also Chicago, Miami, San Francisco, and so forth. Immigration is a fact of life and has been always. And culturally, these places are prepared and ready, and institutionally also, to receive immigrants. We're now going out, following the immigrants actually, out into the smaller cities and towns that they're beginning to populate. And we're starting a study this year with the MacArthur Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, if all goes well, on what's happening in smaller cities and towns around the country where the immigrant population has gone from, in the last 20 years, effectively 0 to maybe 15% of the local population.
That's where the political action is taking place.
Exactly, and that's why I come back. I said it was going to veer, and now I'm going to come back. I think a lot of the country's anxiety about immigration is coming from places who have never seen immigrants before. And that's politically, of course, has a big effect, because that means harden the borders, right? Enforce the immigration law, deport the 12 million illegal immigrants, which is hard to conceive of, but why that plays politically, and why there's quite a bit of political pressure on politicians to sound as though they're honoring those anxieties.
Do you have much connection? We just have a minute and a half left. Do you have much connection or any connection with the politicos?
Any connection. We have thin connections to them. We try. We go to Congress. We talk to people. We tell them about our studies. They're polite, their staff show up and listen to us. But I think right now they're much shorter-term thinkers than we are. We're trying to say, look, in the long run, the American economy looks as though it needs this pool of workers. What's the most humane, sensible way to try to provide for this kind of a labor flow, which the economy needs, and which does not really do damage to the country as long as we manage it in a rational, reasonable way?
Now, you may want to run the clock, and you could almost do that. Are there any candidates now, presidential candidates, who are looking to the information we have, you have, on which to base their thinking?
Okay, not to my knowledge. I could run the clock, but I won't. I'll say no, I don't think so. Right now, during the heated, superheated political atmosphere where every politician is trying not to offend somebody, it's very hard to come out with a systematic and coherent, sensible immigration policy, particularly when Bush of all people, tried and failed. Of course, and he tried very hard to bow towards the nativists by saying we'll harden the border, but we'll have a temporary worker program, and that went down in flames.
You've run the clock.
All right.
Eric Wanner, thank you again for joining me on
too.
The Open Mind.
Great.
And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And for transcripts of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to The Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.